Hello everyone. This is Milk Project. How are you doing today? So in my country, Japan, today is a national holiday called uh, National Foundation Day. So I enjoyed doing nothing. But yeah, it was a good day. It was a restful day. So now I'm gonna read Satantango for an hour or two. But before that, I want to introduce this national holiday a little bit. So according to an AI, National Foundation Day in Japan is a public holiday celebrated on February 11th each year. It is called Kenkoku Kinen no Hi in Japanese. The day commemorates the traditional founding of Japan and the accession of the country's first emperor, Emperor Jimmu. According to Japanese mythology, Emperor Jimmu ascended to the throne on February 11th, 660 BCE. Although this date is based on legend rather than historical evidence, it represents the symbolic beginning of the Japanese nation. National Foundation Day was originally established in the Meiji period in the late 19th century. After World War II, the holiday was abolished for a time, but it was reinstated in 1966 under its current name. Today, the holiday is meant to encourage people to reflect on the origins of the nation and foster a sense of national pride and unity. Some people attend ceremonies held at shrines, while others simply enjoy the day off as a national holiday. Uh, So one might think, is there an Independence Day in Japan? But the answer is no, because we'll have a day of the foundation of the entire nation. All right, so let's review the words we encountered last time. And yeah, last time this app didn't work, but I fixed it. So I hope I can use this app while reading. And yeah, where am I? Let's see. So the word Cretaceous is related to a historical period when means pale or dim, faint, bent, uninterested. Pyrogeny is regional upward of the Platonic portion of continents. I think this word is related to geology. Harbinger. Let's listen.
Harbinger.
Harbinger. A person or thing that foreshadows or foretells the coming of someone or something. Kibosh. So there are two forms, noun and verb. The noun in the word in noun means nonsense, bosh, fashion, style. And the verb means to decisively terminate. Soggy, soaked with moisture or other liquid. In the story, this word appeared with mud and rain, if I remember correctly. 3. Yeah, I think this Japanese translation is incorrect. And this is a word used for a part of the ship. Yep. A protected cove or harbor out of the wind. The side of the ship away from the wind. Blotch. An uneven patch of color or discoloration. Raucous. Again.
Raucous.
Harsh and rough sounding. Loud and annoying. And trivial. A hunt or pursuit. A chase. Alright, so far we've read part 1, sections 1 to 3. So let's start with chapter 4. Okay? Good. Let's get started. Part 1, Chapter 4. The Work of the Spider. 1. Infinity. Turn the fire on, said Caracas the farmer. Autumnal horse files were buzzing around the cracked lampshade, describing drowsy figures of 8 in its weak light. Time and again colliding with the filthy porcelain, so that after each dull little thud, their bodies fell back into the magnetic path they themselves had woven. To continue this endless cycle, obey on a tight closed circuit until the light went out. But the compassionate hand that had the power to undertake such action was still supporting the unshaven face. The landlord's ears were full of the sounds of the rain that never seemed to want to stop, and he was watching the horse files through sleepy eyes, blinking and muttering. "Devil take the lot of you!" Helix was sitting in the corner by the door on an iron-framed, if rather unsteady chair. His waterproof coat but toned up to the chin, a coat that, if he wished to sit down at all, he had to raise to grow in level, because the fact was the rain and wind had not spared either him or his coat, disfiguring and softening them both. Halleck's whole body felt as though it had lost definition, and as for his coat, it had lost whatever resistance to water it once had. Not could it protect him from the roaring cataract of fate, or, as he tended to say, the rain of death in the heart. A rain that beat day and night against both his withered heart and defenseless organs. The pool of water on his boots was growing ever wider. The empty glass in his hand was growing heavier, and however he tried not to hear, there behind him, his elbow propped on the so-called blizzard table, and his sightless eyes turned to the landlord. "What's Coralacus?" Slurping his beer slowly through his teeth, then greedily swallowing it with great gugs. "I said turn it on," he repeated, and then turned his head slightly to the right so he would not miss a single sound. The smell of mold rising from the floor out of the corner of the room surrounded the vanguard cockroaches working their way down the back walls, with the main cockroach army following them to swarm across the oily floor. The landlord responded with an obscene gesture, meeting Halleck's watery eyes with a sly, conspirational smile but hearing the farmer's word of warning. "Don't play, shit-face!" He shrank back in the chair with fright. Behind the tin-topped counter, a poster spot with lime bloomed at a crooked angle on the wall, while on the far side, beyond the circle of light emanating from the lamp, next to a faded Coca-Cola ad, stood an iron-curved hook with a dusty, forgotten head and work coat dangling from it. The coat stiff as an airborne statue. Anyone glancing at it might have mistaken for a hanged man. Torres started off in the direction of the landlord, an empty bottle in his hand. The floor creaked under him, and he pitched slightly forward. His enormous body looming above everything else. For a moment, he was like a bull springing over a fence. He seemed to occupy every available inch of space. Halleck saw the landlord disappear behind the stockroom door and heard him quickly shoot the bolt, and frightened as he was, because something had actually happened. Halleck took some consolation in realizing that, for once, he did not have to take shelter behind the towering stacks of artificial fertilizer that years ago had been piled one on top of the other and had never been moved, or between rows of garden implements and containers of foul-smelling pig will, with his back up against the ice-cold steel door, and he even felt a certain flutter of joy, or maybe just a smidgen of satisfaction of the thought that the master of all that store of glittering wine was now cowering behind locked doors, desperately waiting for some reassuring sound, his life threatened by the powerfully built farmer. "Another bottle!" Caracas angrily demanded. He pulled a fistful of paper money from his pocket, but having moved too fast, he dropped the money, which, after a moment of dignified drifting in the air, landed right next to his enormous boots. Because he was aware, if only briefly, of the rules governing the action of other persons, the degree to which they were predictable or unpredictable, and knowing what he himself should most certainly do. Felix rose, waited for a few seconds to see whether the farmer would bend down to retrieve the cash, cleared his throat, then went over, took out his own last few dimes, and opened his palm. The coins clinked as they ran all over the place, Then, as the last one finally settled, he knelt down on the floor to gather them back. "Pick up my 100 too!" Caracas boomed at him, and Helix, knowing the ways of the world. "I can see right through you." Silently, obediently, slavishly picked up the money and handed it over, all the time brimming with hatred. It was just the denomination he got wrong, he said to himself, still frightened. Just the denomination. Then, a regret question from the farmer. "Who are you?" He sprang to his feet, brushed his knees down, and hopefully, since he couldn't be certain whether the farmer was addressing the landlord or him, leaned against the bar at a safe distance from Caracas, who, was it possible, appeared to be hesitating, so that when Helix finally spoke his frail, hurry audible voice, "Well, how long do you have to wait?" reverberated in the silence and could not be retracted. Nevertheless, obliged as he was to stand near someone as physically powerful as Caracas and having distanced himself as far as he could from the words he had so carelessly uttered, he felt he had forged some vague comradeship with Caracas, the only sort of which he was capable not only because of his easily wounded self-regard, but because his very cells protested against the possibility that he should behave differently from any other forward. Terrified complicity was the only available option. By the time the farmer slowly turned to him, the obligation to remain loyal, something that had long been part of Helix's character, had given way to something else. He felt oddly moved in discovering that a stray remark of his shouldn't have hit the mark. It was so unexpected. He wasn't prepared to find that his own voice, the voice in which he had just spoken, a voice not in the least prepared, could deflect and, to some degree, neutralize the farmer's clear surprise, so he quickly, as a sign of immediate and unconditional withdrawal, added, "Though, of course, it's nothing to do with me." Torques was beginning to lose his temper again. He lowered his head and registered the fact that there before him on the counter stood a row of washed wine glasses. He had just raised his fist when, at that precise moment, the landlord emerged from the stock room and stood on the threshold. He rubbed his eyes and leaned against the door frame, the 2 minutes spent at the back of his emporium being sufficient to wipe away his sudden, and when you came to consider it, ridiculous panic. How aggressive he is! Damn animal! So the damage to his self-esteem could be only skin deep after all. Nothing really serious, and if the big farmer did get under his skin, it was simply another stone dropped down a bottomless well. "Another bottle!" Caracas demanded, and put the money down on the counter. And seeing how the landlord was still keeping a careful distance, added, "Don't be afraid you did it. I won't hurt you. Just stop pointing." By the time he returned to his chair at the billiard table and sat down carefully for fear of someone pulling the chair out from under him, the landlord's chin was propped on his other hand. His whey-colored foxy eyes clouded over the uncertainty, and sort of tangible longing. His fingers long, refined, and polished with long years of laboring on the periphery of that same palm. His shoulders falling in, his belly are cons- conspicuous paunch. Not a muscle of his body moving part of the toes inside his well-worn shoes. All in the close warmth of perpetual civility. The kind of civility that renders the skin torpid and the palm sweaty, shining from his white as chalk face. Then the lamp that had been hanging motionless from the ceiling began to sway, and its narrow aureole of light. No bigger than a slice of bread, the leftmost of the ceiling and the tops of the wall in shadow, offering only enough light to see the three men, the cookies, the dried noodles for soup, the counter covered with wine glasses and bottles of palinka, the chairs, the dead files, gave the bar of the air of ship in a storm in the early evening dusk. Perkins opened the bottle, dragged the glass over with his free hand, and sat there for some minutes without moving, bottle in one hand, glass in the other, as if he had forgotten what to do next. Now that everything had gone quiet, in the absolute dark of his blindness, he felt as if he were deaf too. That everything around him had gone weightless, right down to his own body, his ass, his arms, and the legs spread wide below him, and that any capacity he might have had in the realms of touch or taste or smell had also deserted him, leaving nothing but the throbbing of blood and the calm workings of his organs to disturb his utter lack of consciousness. The mysterious core of his anxiety having withdrawn into his own internal darkness, into the forbidden territories of the imagination, whence it was obliged, time and again, to break free. Alex didn't know what to make of the situation, and shifted here and there in his excitement because he sensed Caracas was watching him. It would have been too presumptuous to interpret his unexpected immobility as a gradually unfolding from invitation. On the contrary, he suspected that the dead eyes turned toward him constituted as a threat. But however he racked his brains, he couldn't remember having committed of any offense for which he ought to bear immediate responsibility. All the more so since in the hard hours, when a man of sorrows like him was plunged deep into the liberating waters of self-knowledge, he had confessed to himself that his comfortable life, which had slipped uneventfully into his 52nd year, was an insignificant in the great rank of competing lives at lives at cigarette smoke in a burning train. This brief, unlocated sense of guilt was in fact guilt at all, since if it was true, as the saying goes, that once the flame of guilt has gone out, it's no more than a dead match. The minimal light remaining is easily identified with some problem in the course, cons- conscience, conscience vanished just as the moment it might have penetrated his soul more deeply, which had entered on the next phase of hysteria, affecting the roof of his mouth, his throat, his gullet, and stomach, all because of something he had prepared himself for far earlier, that being the arrival of the Schmitz and the settling of what was due to him. The cold bow only made the situation worse, and a single glance of the wine rags piled behind the landlord's low stool gave him hysterical imagination, spinning into a whirlpool that threatened to swallow him completely, especially now that finally he heard the glug of wine being poured into the farmer's glass, and couldn't resist looking, some greater power drawing his eyes to the tiny, momentary pearls of port wine. The landlord listened, his eyes kept down, as Halleck's boots cracked across the floor and didn't even look up, when he held his sour breath, feeling no desire at all to confront the beads of perspiration on Halleck's face. Because he knew that, for the third time that evening, he'd give in. "Look, friend," Halleck skillfully cleared his throat. "Just a glass, just one." He gave the landlord a perfectly sincere look, even raising a finger. "The Schmitz will be here, very soon." He raised the newly filled glass with closed eyes very slowly, and drank in small sips. His head tipped back, and once the glass was empty, he kept a little in his mouth so that very last drop might dribble down his throat. "Neat little wine." He smacked his lip in confusion as he gently, somewhat indecisively, put the glass down on the counter like one living in hope right down to the very last moment, then slowly turned away and grumbled to himself. "Pig swell." Before ambling back to his chair, Pericles leaned his heavy head on the green base of the billiards table. The landlord, who was bathed in lamplight, scratched his numb ass, then started flapping at the spider webs with his dishcloth. "Halleck, listen! You hear me? Here, what's going on out there?" Halleck stared uncomprehending, straight in front of him. "Where?" the landlord repeated. "Oh, in the cultural center? Well," he scratched his head. "Nothing in particular." "Okay, but what's playing there now?" "Hatch. Heck." Alex waved. "I've seen it at least 3 times. Actually, I just took my wife and left her there, and came straight over." The landlord sat back on his stool, leaned against the wall, and lit a cigarette. "At least tell me what film they're showing tonight." "That what's its name? Scandal in Solo. Really?" nodded the landlord. The table beside Halleck made a creaking noise, and the rustling wood of the bar gave a slow sigh like the quiet, easy movement of an old carriage wheel over the buzzing chorus of horseflies. It conjured the past, but it also spoke of perpetual decay. And the wood creaked, the wind outside like a helpless hand searching through a dusty book for some vanished main clothes, kept asking the same question time and again, hoping to give a cheap imitation of proper answer. to the bank of solid mat to establish some common dynamic between tree, air, and earth, and to seek through invisible cracks in the door and walls the first and original sound of Herrick's belching. The farmer was snoring on the billiards table, the saliva trickling from his open mouth. Suddenly, like a distant rumble on the horizon, from a vague shape that is slowly getting closer through, though you can't quite tell whether it's a herd of cows being driven home, a school bus, or the sound of marching military band. From the deep pit of Caracas' stomach rose a quite unclassifiable grumble that eventually reached his lips and issued forth in words like bitch and really and or and more, though that was all they could make out. The grumbling culminated in a single movement, a blow aimed at someone or something. His glass tipped over and the pot of wine on the gray baize cloth assumed the shape of a flattened bag for absorbing various other shapes into itself as it soaked in, and the gap in a form of uncertain character. That it had soaked in, or had it simply run between the strands of cloth to lie on the surface of uh, the ribbon boards to establish a series of isolated and conjoined poles, though none of this was the least significant as far as Helix was concerned, because in any case Helix made a hissing noise, "Damn your drag mag," and shook his fist in the direction of Caracas, helpless with rage, as if not wanting to believe his eyes. Turning to the landlord to mutter furious explanation. Now the bastard spilled the stuff. The latter gave Helix a long, significant look before finally glancing over the farmer, not in fact directly at him, but in his general direction, just enough to register the damage. He appraised the inexperienced Helix with supercilious smile, then, giving several little nods, changed the subject. "What a huge ox of a man! A real animal, oh?" Felix stared in confusion at the mocking light glimmering under the landlord's half-closed eyelids, shook his head and took a long look at the bull-like figure of the prostrate farmer. "What do you think?" he numbly asked. "How much does a beast like him need to eat?" "Eat?" The landlord snorted. "He doesn't eat, he feeds." Alex went over to the bar and leaned against it. "He eats half a pig at a sitting. You believe me?" "Sure, I believe you." Curtis gave a loud no snore and then shut them up. They looked at the enormous, immovable body, the big bloodshot head, and the muddy boots protruding from under the shadowy reaches of the billiards table in astonishment and fear, the way people take stock of sleeping predator, doubly assured of safety by the bars and by sleep itself. Alex was seeking, and indeed had found, a minute or a second's worth of comradeship with the landlord, if only in the way a caged hyena and freely circling bent vulture discover a warm, mutual, unself-conscious partnership that welcomed any disaster. but they were awakened from his reverie by an enormous clap, as if the sky was cracking open above them. Immediately after, the bar was lit by a great flash, so you could particularly smell the lightning. That was really close, Alex would have remarked, but at the same time, someone started beating powerfully at the door. The landlord leaped to attention but didn't immediately rush over, because for a moment he was sure there must be some connection between the lightning and the knocking at the door. He only gathered himself together and set to open up when whoever was outside started blowing. So it's you, and the landlord's back was in the way, so Alex saw nothing at first. Then two big heavy boots became visible, then a windbreaker, and finally Kellerman's puffy face hove into sight. His soaked driver had perched on top. Alex stared at him, his eyes wide. The new arrival cursed as he shook his coat free of water and threw it angrily on top of the stove before turning on the landlord, who was still struggling with a bout and had his back to him. Are you all definitely there? There I am trying to wrestle with that bloody door, almost struck by lightning, and nobody comes to open it. The landlord retreated behind the counter, poured a glass of Kalinka, and pushed it in front of the old man. Given the noise of the thunder, it's really not that surprising, the landlord answered by way of excuse. He was fiercely scrutinizing the newcomer, trying quickly to get what had brought him here in the rain, while the glass was trembling in his hand was what he was hiding. But neither he nor Helix asked him anything yet, because there was another great crack in the sky, and all the rain seemed to fall at once, in one great sackful, battering at the roof. The old man tried as best he could to wring the water out of his broad cloth cap, pushed it back into shape, replaced it on his head, and with a careworn look, threw back the palinka. Now, for the first time, she's searching for the lost track in dense darkness, a track no one could remember using. The track covered in weeds and rank grass. The excited profiles of his two horses flashed for him as they inexplicably kept glancing back at their helpless but determined master, their tails nervously twitching, and he heard again their heavy pounding over the squeak and creak of the cart as it rattled over dangerous potholes. And he saw himself still surrounding in the driver's seat, then holding on the reins, holding onto the reins, up to his ankles in mud, leaning against the driving wind in his face, and it was only now he really believed what had happened, that but for Irmash and Petrina, it never had set off, because there was no power greater than theirs that could have forced him, because he felt quite certain now that it was true, because he saw himself in the shadow of their great power, like a common foot soldier on the battlefield when he sensed rather than hears the order given by his commanding officer and goes about his duties without anyone having told him to do so. And so the image moves silently past its eyes in ever more style stilted sequence, as if everything man might would hold dear and consider vital to protect existed as part of someone independent, indissol- indissoluble, indissoluble system. And while one's memory was still functional enough to furnish it with a degree of certainty and bring into existence its lightly fleeting now, as well as validating the living strands of the roles of the system in the open field of event, one was forced to bridge the gap between memory and life, not with a sense of freedom, but rather bound by the cramped satisfaction simply of being the processor of the memory. And so, as this stage, given the first opportunity of bringing these things to mind, he felt the terror in everything that had happened, though pretty soon he would begin to cling to the memory with an ever greater jealous uh, possi- possessiveness, however often in the few years still remaining to him, the memory recurred right down to the last time he conjured these images while leaning out of the tiny north-facing window of the farmhouse at the most miserable time of night, alone and sleepless, waiting for dawn. Where have you just come from? The landlord eventually asked. From home. Alex looked surprised and took a step nearer. But that's at least half a day's journey. The visitor silently lit a cigarette. On foot? Asked the landlord in certainty. Of course not. Horses, cart. The old track. He had been warmed through by the drink now, and he looked at each face in turn, blinking a little, but he hadn't yet told him what he wanted to tell them, nor did he know how to begin, because the moment wasn't quite right, or to put it more precisely, he was unable to decide about the moment because he didn't know what it was hoping for. And even if it was plain to him that the sense of vacancy and tedium radiated by the very walls of was only an appearance, and even if this spot was to be the site of as yet invisible but therefore all the more feverish forces in coming hours, and even if the wild cries of party that would soon engulf them were already audible but not yet present, he was nevertheless expecting far more than this, a more feverish sense of anticipation than the landlord and Alex were able to offer, and so he felt fate was letting him down badly by presenting him with just these two people, a landlord from a veritable chasm divided him, because the people he regarded as the traveling public, or more strictly as the generic passengers, were to the landlord mere guests. And Helix a flat tire of a man to whom expressions such as discipline, firmness of purpose, fighting spirit, and reliability meant nothing now or ever had. The landlord was tensely watching the shadows in the nape of the driver's neck, his breathing slow and careful. Felix, meanwhile, was convinced, at least until the drivers started the story, that someone must have died. News quickly spread on the estate, and the half hour it took before the landlord returned was plenty enough for Helix. He was in touching distance, secretly to examine what was really behind the tables on those bottles on the shelf. The ones saying Riesling, a name that was filled with various associations for him, and there was even enough time in the presence of sleeping figure and another vaguely nodding off to make a lightning quick test of his long-stated hypothesis that when wine was watered down, the color of the mixture, because it was quite a different matter he had in mind, bore an easily confusable likeness to the wine's original color. At the same time, he successfully concluded his inspection. Mrs. Helix, who was on her way to the bar, thought she saw a star falling from the sky above the mill. She stopped dead in her tracks and put her head to her heart, but however nearly and stubbornly she scanned the sky, a sky that seemed to be full of ringing bells, she was obliged to admit that it was probably just her eyes sparkling with the unexpected excitement. Nevertheless, the uncertainty, the mere possibility of a decisive event against an opposite side of the desolate landscape, pressed on her so heavily that she changed her mind, turned back to the house, took out her ragged Bible from under the pile of crisply ignored washing, and with an increasing sense of guilt, set off again down the metalled road by the sign that used to bear the name of this estate, and walked the 107 steps, so to the bar against the driving rain, while her mind sought to grasp the developing state of affairs. In order to gain a little time, because in her agitated state of words were merely clanging around her head, and because she wanted to convey her message. We were living in apocalyptic times. With a blinding, irresistible clarity, she stopped at the bar door and waited until a phrase came to her, only throwing open the door and crossing the threshold once she felt sure it was the right phrase, the right word, at which point she entered, to the astonishment of all within, with a single cry of resurrection. Our whole power was such as to increase the spellbinding effect of her entrance, the term itself being enough to demand attention. Hearing it, the farmer's head snapped back in the fear. The driver leaped from his place as if he had been stabbed, and the landlord started back so violently and so suddenly that he hit his head against the wall and was knocked semi-conscious as a result. Soon after that, they recognized Mrs. Helix. The landlord couldn't stop himself shouting at her, "For God's sake, Mrs. Helix, what in heaven's name is the matter with you?" Then attempted to screw the broken bolt back in the door. Helix was overcome with embarrassment and tried to drag his overexcited, gabbling wife over to the nearest chair. We was no easy matter. Come along with you, for God's sake. Look at the rain coming in. Attempting to calm her by simply nodding to everything she said, her speech being a blend of high pathos and whimpering terror, and ended only when Mrs. Helix noticed the landlord and the driver giving each other a mocking look, and cried out in fury, "It's nothing to laugh at. There's nothing in the least bit funny about it." At which point Helix finally managed to push her into the chair next to his at the corner table. There she retreated into a wounded silence, clutching the Bible to her bosom, looking over the heads of the others into a kind heavenly haze, her eyes misting over with a blissful sense of certainty derived from above. In her own mind she stood as straight as a post, high above a magnetic field of bent heads and backs, the proud unassailable place she occupied in the inn, a space she was unwilling to vacate. Like a vent in the closed bar, a vent through which foul air could escape so that numbing, frozen, poisonous draft from outside might rush in and take its place. In the tense silence, the continual buzzing of the horseflies was the only audible sound. That and the constrained rain beating down in the distance, and uniting the two, the ever more frequent scratch of the bent acacia trees outside, and the strangled night shift work of the bags in the table legs and in various parts of the counter, whose irregular pulse measured out the small parcels of time, apportioning the narrow space into which a word, a sentence, or movement might perfectly fit. The entire end of October night was beating with a single pulse, its own strange rhythms sounding through trees and rain and mud in a manner beyond words of vision, a vision present in the low light, in the slow passage of darkness, the blurred shadows, in the working of tired muscles, in the silence in its human subject, in the undulating surface of the metal road, in the hair moving to a different beat than do the dissolving fibers of the body. Growth and decay on their divergent paths, all these thousands echoing rhythm with confusing clatter of night noise, all parts of an apparently common stream. There is the attempt to forget despair, though behind things other things appear as if by mischief, and once beyond the power of the eye they no longer hang together. So with the door left open as if forever, with the lock that will never open. There is a chasm, a crevice. 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 The landlord, having discovered it was a waste of energy trying to find a firm patch in the rotten door, threw the bolt aside and made do with a wedge, then sat back on his stool with a curse. The gap, still a gap. He eventually muttered, resigned to the fact, so that his body at least might get a rest, and so be able to resist the spiraling anxiety that, as he well knew, would soon overtake him. Because it was all in vain, he no sooner felt a sudden and violent desire to be revenge on Mrs. Hallix, then the desire was overtaken by a precipitous descent into despondency. He took a look around the tables, estimated how much wine and palinka there was left, then got up and pulled the storeroom door closed behind him. Now that no one could see him, he gave his rage free rein, shaking his fist and making terrifying faces, keenly aware of the smell of rust. The smell of love, as he often had occasion to term it when the Holocaust girls had pitched their headquarters there. And running his eye straight down in the line of untouched goods, as he always did when wanting to think over some pressing problem, toward the window that was protecting him from potential roadside thieves by 2 iron bars of a finger's thickness each, as well as a dense weave of cobwebs. Then back along the sacks of the floor, past the high piles of flat stuff right down to the little desk where he kept his business books, his notes, and his tobacco, and various personal belongings, and finally back to the small window there. Having already made a discourteous remark regarding the creator who was trying to ruin his life with these filthy spiders without feeling any particular keen emotion either way, he turned to his right and, stepping over a pile of spilled grain, soon reached the iron door again. It was all nonsense. He didn't believe in any kind of resurrection and was happy to leave such humbug to Mrs. Helix, who was well acquainted with humbug of all sorts. Though one might of course feel a certain uneasiness if it suddenly turned out that someone thought dead should turn out to be alive. Okay, let's stop here. Alright, so we read for an hour today. Alright. Let's take a quick look at the verse we saw this time. Porcelain. The plants Slimax China, a liana of much of Eastern Asia. Porcelain. Smidgen, a very small quantity or amount. Cower, to crouch or cringe or to avoid or shy away from something in fear. Cower. Is it related to the word coward? Well, I don't know. Glug. The sound made when a significant amount of liquid is poured suddenly out of something, such as a jug or bottle. The amount of liquid issued when the glug sound is heard. Maybe this represents a sound when someone pours some liquid. And translation is incorrect. Haunch. The first compartment of the stomach of a ruminant, the rumen. Haunch. The thickened rim of the bell struck by a clapper to remove the internal organs of a ruminant prior to eating. It can be used for humans and also for animals, I guess. Oreo. A circle of light or halo around the head of deity or a saint. Aureole. A corona. A ring around an igneous intrusion. So something saint and a light or halo. And riven. Okay. Riven. To tear apart by force. Riven. Okay. Or torn apart, broken into pieces. Rain. A strap or rope attached to a bridge or bed used to control a horse. An instrument or means of curbing, restraining, or governing. So something you control, something you use for controlling a horse or a child or some system. That makes sense. All right. Yeah, actually, I've heard this word, but I don't quite remember. And tedium. So basically, this means tediousness. Okay. Nape. The back part of the neck. Nape. Okay. Desolate. Okay. Desolate. Desolate. To deprive of inhabitants. Desolate. Okay. Crevice. Narrow crack or fissure. As in a rock or wall. Crevice. Yeah, I knew this word, but I didn't know the spelling. Crevice. Humbug. To play a trick on someone or to cheat or swindle, to deceive. To waste time talking or something hoax, jest or prank or nonsense. Okay, so I'm gonna stop here. And next time I will read I will continue to read from about the half of section 4 of part 1. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.